Good evening, everybody. Thank you for listening to Mr. Sankton and I kibitz for a few minutes. Thanks for joining us, taking a break from the Olympics here. A couple things before we get started. As you know, all our talks are brought to us by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, Martha's Vineyard Savings, and all the books that are on our tour are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So we hope that you visit the locals. As you gathered, our author Julian Sankton is coming to us from Larchmont, New York. He just came back from Italy, so I'm quite jealous of that. He formerly wrote for Departures magazine, and as his bio said, we were just talking about this. He's visited every continent, including Antarctica, where he wrote about this book. Would you welcome our guest tonight, Julian Sankton?
Thanks very much for having me. I wish I could join in person. It's just as enviable a destination as Italy in my mind, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to discuss this book. It came out a little while ago, but I'm still I'm glad for every opportunity I have to be able to talk about the book, because this was just so much fun to write, and it's the kind of book that I endeavored to write the kind of book that I like to read. So the kind of adventure books that I read as a kid, and so I hope that the result will have the same effect on readers out there with a hankering for adventure. So the book is Madhouse at the End of the Earth, and it's the story of the Belgica expedition. And if that name doesn't ring a bell, that's not an accident. It's in one of the first expeditions, if not the first expedition, of the what's known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. You may have heard of Ernest Shackleton. You may have heard of Robert Falcon Scott. You may have heard of Roald Amundson's expedition to the South Pole. All of these came after the Belgica, and I argue in the book, benefited greatly from the adventures and misadventures of the Belgica and the lessons learned therein. The Belgica expedition, as you might have guessed, took off from Belgium, which is a strange place for a ambitious Antarctic expedition to leave from, given that it didn't have much of a maritime tradition at the late, nor it had only about 40 miles of coastline, and any would-be adventurer worth his salt would be more likely to seek his fortune in the Congo, that abhorrent experiment in colonialism run by Leopold II as his own personal property, rather than in the Antarctic, which just seemed like an impossibly distant shore. And yet it was from there that the Belgica left, thanks to the dreams of its originator, of its the commander Adrien de Gerlache, a young Belgian aristocrat, who decided that there was no reason why Belgium couldn't do this, and why he, of all people, couldn't grab the prize ring at the bottom of the world map. That then the Antarctic stood as a kind of a void at the bottom of the maps, of the world maps, and he intended to fill it. So the expedition left Antwerp in August 1897 amid great fanfare, and set sail for, as I say, the largely unknown continent of Antarctica. But what began as the first purely scientific expedition to the southernmost continent became a grueling struggle for survival after the expedition's commander, de Gerlache, decided to sail his ship, which was called the Belgica, deep into the pack ice, thereby ensuring that he and his men would become the first to ever endure a winter in the Antarctic and suffer the cruelties of the endless night. On one level, this book is the classic story of man against nature, a fight in which each side can claim victories and defeats. But on another level, it's also, in my telling, the story of three men who all shared dreams of polar glory. yet who were driven to radically different destinies because of their own foibles, their own strengths, and their own physical constitutions. One of those men I mentioned is Adrien de Gerlache, a um, not the person you would expect to when you imagine of a great polar explorer. Um, he was a retiring, sensitive, aloof character. As I mentioned, he was aristocratic in his birth, but also in his bearing. He was a um, a dreamer and happened to have been a great sailor. The only place he was ever happy as a youth was when he was on the deck of a ship. And even though his father had other desires for his son, he realized that Adrien was simply miserable on land, and um, and ultimately gave in to his aspirations of seafaring. De Gerlache who made this expedition a reality. Another of these men is Roald Amundsen. I mentioned him earlier as in the context of his South Pole expedition. He was a Norwegian who is famous today for being probably the most accomplished polar explorer of all time. He reached not only the South Pole, but also blazed through the fabled Northwest Passage, which had doomed many explorers before him. Um, and is very possibly the first man to the North Pole as well. And the reason there is a doubt hanging over that has to do with the third character in and sorry, I should mention that Roald Amundsen, the reason the role he plays in this story is he was the first mate of the Belgica. It was his first expedition, his first exposure to the polar elements, and an apprenticeship of sorts for him. And the third man, and in many ways the hero of this book, is Frederick Cook, an American. He was the sole American on board. He was the ship's doctor. And if Cook is remembered at all today, it's for lying about having reached the North Pole in 1908, and he came back to New York from 2 years in the Arctic, claiming to have reached the top of the world, and he was celebrated as the Neil Armstrong of his day, before it was revealed that that his attainment was almost certainly fabricated, and he was then decried as I guess the Lance Armstrong of his day for having fabricated that accomplishment. However, in the case of the Belgica, Cook was a genuine hero, and for me that dynamic that between Cook's later years and his later infamy. I should add that he was also imprisoned for 10 years or 7 years in Leavenworth Penitentiary for running a Ponzi scheme. He was a kind of a cross between P.T. Barnum and Bernie Madoff, and yet, as I say, on the Belgica, he was a genuine hero, and we'll get to why. But for me, that contrast between his later years and his heroism aboard the Belgica was just so poignant, and it made for a really rich character, colorful, in some ways unreliable, but never boring character. He's the heroic anti-hero for me, is the ultimate character for an adventure story like this. It's like Indiana Jones or Han Solo, disreputable rogues who end up doing incredible things. Those three men together, and their stories shed light on what drives human exploration, what drives people to seek out the unknown and confront the dangers and uncertainties of the planet's most hostile environments. They're questions we face today as we prepare to reach a new frontier, which is the surface of Mars, which I guess we're expected to reach in 2030 or something, as if we stay on schedule. But that's in fact how I discovered the story. Is in 2015, I was reading an article. I was sitting at my desk at Departures magazine, and was killing time by reading an article in the New Yorker in about NASA's plans to study the effects of long-term isolation and confinement for long-duration missions to Mars. And one of the ways that they study that is to um, organize these kind of biodome type experiments, these simulations that in which a number of astronauts isolate themselves and in a suitably Martian-like environment, such as the Hawaiian volcano or something, and go about their business, and we can study through surveys. You can study their psychology and the psychological effects, but that can only yield so much, because they know they're in a um, controlled study, and which is why NASA took such interest in um, polar expeditions of the early 20th and late 19th century, which proved to be extremely valuable analogs, both cautionary tales and lessons on what to do and what not to do. And the article that I read began with a short summary of this unknown to me expedition called the Belgian Antarctic expedition, and I was hooked in those first three paragraphs by a number of things. One was the fact that many of the men went mad, and there was, for me, that struck a chord, because it reminded me of with the Gothic fiction of the 19th century, particularly a book that I loved as a child called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym by Edgar Allan Poe, which sorry, Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, I should add, which is, I guess, geographically nearby to all of you. But what I loved about that book, as flawed as it is, was this sort of connection that it drew between the furthest, the high, between the ends of the earth and the furthest recesses of the mind, and that somehow the further you go, the more mad you would get. And so the fact that there was, and throughout the 19th century, from Frankenstein to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, shortly before the turn of the century, to even Arthur Conan Doyle wrote stories of polar fiction, and Jules Verne. All of these books drew some kind of connection between the poles and madness, and the fact that the Belgian Antarctic expedition should have, I guess, corroborated that literary notion, and proved it to have some kind of truth. I found that irresistible. And then when I read about Cook's interventions and the redemption of this notorious American figure, I figured that this was such a fantastic story. And I first thing I did is I called a friend of mine who's a screenwriter out in Los Angeles, and I said, this is your first movie. This is an incredible story. And he kind of blasé. He answered, man, in Hollywood these days, nobody makes anything original anymore. It's got to be based on something. So maybe if there were a book, we could talk. And so I got to that inspired me to see if there had been a book about it, and sure enough, there hadn't. So I decided that I would write it, and that's how I started on the project. And I was afraid that one of the reasons there hadn't been a book written about it, aside from a few memoirs written by the men who survived it in the first few years of the 20th century, I believed that it had to do with possibly a lack of primary sources. I mean, there's a lot of great stories out there that I'd love to be able to tell, but I don't write fiction, and everything that I that I know how to do is the way I know how to write is to draw details from the primary sources. And even though I try to write it as a novel, I don't make anything up. And so I was afraid that possibly the historical record was thin, but in fact, I was very fortunate in that of the 17 or I guess 19 men who arrived in the Antarctic aboard the Belgica in 1897. 11 wrote some kind of day-to-day account, some kind of detailed account, whether it's a diary or a log, um, or scientific observations. And and all but one has survived to this day, and the one that didn't is the one obviously that I would most like. And that is a diary that was kept by one of the men who went mad and never recovered his reason, and his shipmates preferred to burn the diary rather than let posterity see the horrors that it presumably contained. Um, but in any case, that provided that proved to be the basis of my story, and I ended up to also traveling to Belgium to find the voluminous archives of this expedition stuffed in some locker somewhere that which was a historian's dream, um, save for the fact that there was no organization to it, or little, and meeting with also meeting with the descendants of some of the men, notably de Gerlache and the ship's captain Georges Lecointe. And finally, as part of my research, as you may have heard before the beginning of the talk, I traveled to Antarctica, to specifically the part um, of the continent on the peninsula that the men first discovered and explored with the joy of knowing that they were the first men to see this part of the earth. And it became kind of a beautiful reverie that gave way to horror very soon after, as they left that the coastlines and got trapped in the sea ice. And we'll get to that in a second. So, I mean, one of the things that really struck me about this expedition is the international makeup of it. De Gerlache was not able to find enough qualified Belgian sailors, or willing scientists to fill his ranks. Everybody was afraid that it was a poorly financed, poorly organized affair, and to an extent they were right to be afraid, because it was. And but so de Gerlache, determined as he was, filled out the ranks of sailors with Norwegians, which he assumed would have a better feel for the sea, especially for navigating in the ice. And then the scientists, he picked 3 Eastern European scientists, 1 Romanian and 2 Poles. And as I mentioned, the American doctor Cook. And Cook was a last-minute addition to the crew, because de Gerlache couldn't hang on to a doctor. He fired one, two of them left, and the last one that he picked got cold feet, so to speak, and quit the day before the expedition was supposed to leave. So it left de Gerlache in the unenviable position of having to leave for the most I guess the most cruel environment on Earth, without a surgeon. And he would then, thankfully, he left and the ship had engine trouble and had to turn back, and that just convinced him that it was foolish to leave without a surgeon. So he answered a telegram that he had ignored, from New York, from a certain Dr. Cook, who was, I guess, somewhat famous for having participated in an Arctic expedition before, about 7 years earlier, in Greenland. And that made it was brilliant decision of de Gerlache to hire Cook, it would turn out, um, in large part because Cook was the only person who had any experience of polar exploration. It boggles my mind that there was only one such person on board at that time, and and that it came very close to there being no one with any relevant experience on board this expedition. But in any case, he did hire Cook, and that would prove to be a brilliant move because of everything that Cook brought to the expedition. Now, the the expedition had two main goals, I believe, which were largely incompatible. At that time, the Antarctic, as I mentioned, there hadn't been a. This is in 1895 when he was beginning to plan the expedition. At that time, it had been 50 years since the last serious expedition, exploratory expedition to the Antarctic. There had been a number of whalers and sealers who had made their way far south, but no attempt to study the continent scientifically, and so one of de Gerlache's the world's geographical societies had agreed that the exploration of the Antarctic was of the foremost urgency, and so de Gerlache decided that he would pick up that challenge. And so one of his goals was to embark on a thorough scientific study of the continent, or at least of the stretch of the continent. And the other goal, which he figured was this, he figured he needed some kind of coup, some kind of first, some kind of exploit to electrify the Belgian public and get them to back the expedition and to excite the press and get it written about. And so he believed that that would be the attainment of the South Magnetic Pole, which is different from the geographic pole, which is where all meridians meet and the point from which every direction is north. The activity in the Antarctic in the southern hemisphere, and that is an eternally moving target, and it had never been reached. It depends on the churn of magma in the Earth's core, and so it's where all compasses point, and reaching it would have been of a great coup, and would have been of some use to help correct navigational readings. So those two goals were to a large extent incompatible, because the first one, the exploration of the coast, required a diligent and diligent study, required a lot of time and attention, and required the scientists to move slowly and deliberately and meticulously, and so that took a lot of time. Now, the other goal, reaching the South Magnetic Pole, would require sailing as fast as possible to reach the shores of Victoria Land on the other side of the continent, to land a party there before the winter ice set in, and that required moving as fast as possible. That required, and so de Gerlache was never able to square that circle. By the time he reached the shores of Antarctica, he was a few months behind schedule already, having indulged the curiosity of the scientists in South America and of Cook, who wanted to study the native populations of Tierra del Fuego. The ship had run aground and almost crashed against the reef in Tierra del Fuego, and there was a near mutiny that he had to confront, and he also had lost a man who fell overboard during a terrible storm on the way down to the Antarctic. So the expedition was already very delayed at that point, and he realized that the winter ice was already starting to set in, and so he was faced with a choice. Either he comes home with a with little to show for his first year of the expedition, and having spent all the money and needing to beg for more funds, or he would attempt another kind of exploit. Um, he saw that as this another storm had shattered the pack and opened up avenues into the sea ice, the avenues pointing to the south, and surely they would close up soon enough. But he sensed an opportunity. Dujralash thought, well, if I can't reach the South Magnetic Pole, then perhaps I can at least sail as far south as possible here. Goal, which is um, he knew that there was a strong likelihood that the ship would be encased in ice if he sailed into the pack, and but that would guarantee that he and his men would become the first to spend a winter in the Antarctic, and that in itself was an extremely valuable resource. I mean, there was the stories are what exploration is built on. At least at that time, that's how explorers built their fame and sold books and you know um, attracted investors through these kind of stories. So he you know the more harrowing the story, the more I guess the more glory would be attached to it, and it was a bold gamble, and sure enough, the men suffered tremendously from his decision, because 2 weeks after he sailed into the pack, the ship was stuck fast, and the ice wouldn't relinquish the ship for many months, more than a year. During that time, the men suffered from the effects of darkness, of cold. They showed both physical and mental symptoms. The physical symptoms consisted of um, uh, they became bloated, they became uh, lethargic, uh, their skin turned a sort of a waxy texture, and they took on a ghostly pallor, and they just looked like walking corpses. And the mental symptoms. Oh, and in addition to that, their heart rates varied tremendously. They fluctuated between 30 beats a minute and to 150 beats a minute at rest. And the Cook believed that the absence of the sun had something to do with it. He says that without the sun, the heart acts like a ship without a governor. And it's still unclear what the men were suffering from. There's various theories. Cook knew that, although he didn't mention it for fear of panicking the men, that they were suffering from scurvy, which is, as we now know, a lack of vitamin C. But in those days, it was not known. The vitamins hadn't been discovered yet. And another thing that it could be is beriberi disease, which is another vitamin deficiency, in this case of vitamin B1. But scurvy was a broader term then, and so it would have applied to that too. Many of the symptoms that the men felt, but there was also that alone couldn't explain it. Cook was sure that the lack of light played a role, and to this day, he was very far ahead of his time in that sense, because as you may have heard of seasonal affective disorder, which is a depression, a form of depression that comes about in the winter months in high latitudes where the sun disappears for a long time. And Cook diagnosed that and tried to combat it with a primitive form of light therapy, which he had the men stand naked in front of a roaring fire, in hopes that since he couldn't bring the Belgica to the sun, because it was stuck in the ice, that in some way he could bring the sun to the Belgica. He believed that the human body craves the sun almost as much as plants do. And he this is, there's also, but there was another thing that the men were suffering from, and this couldn't be explained by these factors. They became they were forced to the brink of insanity by the confinement, which we can all sort of identify with after a year of on and off lockdowns and of fear and uncertainty. And a few of the men actually teetered into outright madness, and the book discusses why that may be. But I wanted to read a passage about one of the most alarming occurrences that took place during this time, when it wasn't yet clear what was ailing the men, and de Gerlache himself was suffering almost more than anyone. He was alone in his cabin with lancing headaches, and he was out of commission. And now all of a sudden, the captain, Georges Lecointe, who would have inherited command of the ship, was at death's door. He was also a very gifted navigator who was responsible for being essentially the ship's GPS, by using a sextant to chart the position of the ship, to chart the stars and mark the position of the ship. So here we go. Just before midnight on July 10th, Lecointe pulled off his covers and slid out of his bunk to start his 4-hour watch. The floor felt different beneath his feet. He noticed that his legs had become hideously engorged to swell. Since Cook hadn't dared to utter the name of the disease that was now eating away at the men, Lecointe didn't realize that these were signs of advanced scurvy. He dismissed his concerns and finished dressing. Duty was duty. As sick as he had gotten over the previous few weeks, he had never missed a watch. He limped outside to perform his meteorological and celestial observations. It was a calm, clear night, and the stars shone brightly. Lecointe normally savored these moments of solitude, these silent exchanges between him and the sky. But on this morning, he was so fatigued and in such pain that he could barely make it to the end of his watch. He struggled back into his bunk and found that his legs and hand had ballooned. Despite his exhaustion, the captain was unable to sleep. He remained in a delirious torpor, staring at the rolled-up maps he had strapped to the ceiling for want of storage space in his cabin. An hour or so later, in a half-sleep, he tried to adjust his position. To his horror, his legs and his left arm did not respond to his commands. He was paralyzed. He wanted to scream for help, but was wary of panicking his shipmates. At around 6 a.m., he managed to grope his way out of bed and crawl across the darkened wardroom to Cook's cabin, his legs dragging uselessly behind him. Cook awoke to a nightmarish apparition, bloated and grotesque and stricken with terror. "Doctor, I am going. I will follow Danko," Lecointe rasped, clinging to Cook's bedside. "Death is creeping up to me from my feet. See my ankles, it's all over." Cook looked down at Lecointe's legs and felt a cold shiver rush down his spine. To give his bleary brain time to react, Cook began mechanically performing examinations on the captain. He feared not just for Lecointe, but for the entire expedition. With de Gerlache in critical condition and frequently holed up in his cabin, Lecointe was, in the doctor's mind, the most commanding figure among us. Were he to succumb, the rest of the men, already teetering on the brink of insanity, would surely give in to despair. He took Lecointe's vitals. His heart rate was high, his pulse was weak, his face was swollen, his skin was cold, waxy, and shockingly pale. Had Danko ever looked so ill? That Lecointe claimed to have lost the use of his limbs indicated either a terminal stage of scurvy or a hysterical fear reaction. Neither boded well. "Men are not dead until the doctor closes the eyes," Cook said, attempting to conceal his alarm. "If you come under my orders, will you do exactly as told?" Yes, said LeCointe, I am at your mercy. Cook was convinced that LeCointe would not live another day, but LeCointe did what Cook told him to do, and which was to um, eat a diet consisting exclusively of penguin and seal meat, and submit to what he called the baking treatment, which is this light therapy I alluded to. Um, the and Surely enough, the effects of scurvy were reversed as surely. And the you may ask what it is in penguin meat that combats scurvy, and this was based on just a brilliant um, a theory or hypothesis of Cook's, which is that um, he had spent time with the Inuit and believed that Inuit practices, modes of dress, and diets were much better suited to polar environments. It seems obvious to us now, but it wasn't then, than Western practices. And so he had noticed that throughout the uh, the year, the Inuit eat exclusively meat, or almost exclusively meat, traditionally, and yet they suffer. They don't suffer from scurvy, and so he concluded from that there must be something in that diet that combats scurvy. That fresh lemon juice was a known cure. Sauerkraut was a known cure. The Royal Navy had replaced lemon juice with lime juice, which is cheaper and less effective, but and lime juice is what de Gerlache had brought on board to ward off scurvy, but it hadn't seemingly hadn't done the trick. And Cook believed that actually everybody believed that scurvy was a disease of the past. That because we had figured, or the cure, certain cures had been discovered, that no one was going to suffer from it again. But that wasn't that. In fact, the lime juice that had become the predominant cure had lost all the vitamin C in the bottling process, and so it took a long time for ocean-going expeditions to discover that bottled lime juice was less effective, because the ocean voyages were so much shorter then, thanks to the steam engine. And so it was only on aboard expeditions like the Belgica, where they were stuck with eating canned food long after the last fresh fruit they brought with them had been eaten or gone rotten. Um, that It was 3 months in that the effects of scurvy took hold. And so Cook prescribed a diet of penguin and seal meat, fresh, eaten as raw as could be stomached. For those who were able to keep the meat down, it proved to be an extremely effective cure against scurvy. Most of the men were revolted by it. One man wasn't, and that was Roald Amundsen, who relished suffering. He believed that suffering was part and parcel with exploration. That he was sort of a masochist in that sense. He wasn't learning, that he wasn't getting closer to his goal of being the world's greatest polar explorer if he wasn't suffering in some way. So he associated suffering with accomplishment to the point where it didn't feel like suffering anymore. So he enjoyed eating raw penguin steaks, and enjoyed probably even more the expression of disgust on his shipmates' faces as he did it. Cook, I don't want to get too far ahead of the story, but Cook, his sense of imagination, and his sense of his I guess expansive sense of the possible, which would later land him in trouble for running a Ponzi scheme, and for fabricating certain accomplishments, led to the salvation of the expedition in more ways than one, and in fact was the main force behind a demented escape plan that could either lead to the ship's salvation, or or exit from the ice, or condemn the ship and everyone aboard to a watery grave. And so I hope that you will read the book to find out how that went down. But I promise it's one of the great battles between man and nature, and it just for me rivals the construction of the pyramids for its ambition. And so, albeit their construction materials were consisted of nothing but frozen water, as opposed to massive blocks of stone, but nonetheless, one of a great achievement. And you'll have to read the book to find out what happens. But I wonder whether if there are no questions, maybe we might be able to Mark, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to hear about any other aspect of this book.
Oh, thank you, Julian. That was great. Yeah, and if you got any questions, feel free to use the chat or down below. But I'm listening to this and I'm riveted. And first of all, how long? I know it's quote unquote eternal night down there, but how long does night last in Antarctica?
Well, it depends where you are. So the Antarctic Circle is defined as the line beyond which the parallel beyond which the sun disappears or does not rise for at least 24 hours. And it varies, but it's around 67 degrees, something like that, if I'm not mistaken. And at that point, the sun disappears for a day or two. But they were far further down, or further south, for 70 days, and when it did come back, it wasn't immediate. It was at first a brief gloaming, and then finally a sunrise, which was greeted by the men as just a jolt in their hearts. Even though it lasted for a second, the first sunrise, the afterglow remained in their eye for a long time, and was greeted as a great source of joy. But also it's paradoxically, it's after the sun returned that the most alarming symptoms manifested themselves, because, and this is typical of expeditions since, or Antarctic personnel tend to report the most alarming mental symptoms after the return of the sun, I guess, but because they believe that they've endured the worst, and yet they realize that there's still a long time before they're going to be able to return to civilization. Excuse me, I'm going to plug my computer in, which it's losing juice. Yeah, so that the night lasted 70 days, and then very quickly the sun returned for about 25 more minutes at times, 25 more minutes of daylight every day, and then by January it was constant sun, which was just as maddening.
You made mention of the fact that Roald Amundsen was the only one that had Arctic experience.
Cook was the only one who had
Cook was. I'm sorry. How prevalent was Arctic and Antarctic? Just exploration at that point. Because we know, there's kind of the thrill of the hunt. No one's been there before, but
yeah.
What was the pool of candidates that actually had any kind of experience in going and trying to go to any pole?
Well, in the Arctic, there were a number. There at that time, when de Gerlache left for the Antarctic, there were no fewer than 4 expeditions trying to find their way to the North Pole, and there were there were dozens of people who had traveled through the Arctic, many trying to find the Northwest Passage that Roald Amundsen ended up being able to blaze. And then many sent after the people who failed to do that to try to recover their bodies. So no, there was plenty of, and in fact, Cook and Perry had gone on a number of expeditions. Fridtjof Nansen, the great Norwegian explorer. I think there was many more. There were many more expeditions to the Arctic than there were to the Antarctic. It was neglected, so distant, and so intimidating. But shortly after the Belgica expedition, there was a slew of Antarctic expeditions that followed in its wake.
Your friend tells you about this. You discover this information. When you're reading about Mars exploration, you call up your friend, said make a movie about this, and he said, "Oh, well, it needs to be based on something, so you write a book."
Yeah.
How long does it take you to write a book, and is he making the movie?
Well, he's working on the movie as it happens. There's no movie yet, but he's shopping it around, and we're hoping that he can make that work. And but it took me from that moment, that was in 2015, and it took me, I guess I turned in the book in 2020, so it took me 5 years from that point, but the research took about 2 years, and then the writing took about a year, and so it was, hopefully the next one won't take quite so long.
What was it about Cook that fascinated you so? I mean, was it just the roguish thing?
It's the roguish thing, but no, it's the fact that that's just one side of the coin, and that he sort of, for me, exemplified this quintessential American spirit, where deceit and deceit and optimism are just are two sides of the coin, two sides of the same coin. He's on the sort of razor's edge between delusion and ingenuity, and that his deception wasn't necessarily out of malice. It was almost more out of aspiration and hope, and that somehow he would will things to be true, and sometimes it worked out, in the sense that he followed his hunch, in the case of the Belgica, about the various remedies that he prescribed to the men, and it worked out. And so that appealed to me. And I also read, in all accounts, he is a beloved by everybody he runs across, whether it's in the Belgica or in Leavenworth, where he became a physician's attendant, and he was the most popular man in prison. He would listen very closely to his patients' complaints, and he treated them almost like his children. And I think that natural empathy may have had a big role to play in their recovery. And I read through a lot of his unpublished writing and his letters in the collection of the Library of Congress, and he's just a man I would have loved to meet. He was overflowing energy, with imagination, with love, with empathy. He was he believed in in racial equality, and a lot of things that we would consider progressive values today. And so I was just greatly attracted to him.
You said as part of this that you interviewed some descendants. Who did you talk to? What did you learn? What was their reminiscences or take on all of this?
Well, I met with the great grandson of Adrien de Gerlache, and he is the latest in a line of adventurers. It became kind of a family tradition after de Gerlache. De Gerlache's son, Gaston de Gerlache, ran his own Antarctic expedition in the 50s, and and then his two sons, Bernard and Jean-Louis, became Arctic explorers as well. And then Henri de Gerlache, who greeted me at the family estate outside of Ghent, a beautiful place filled with all sorts of memorabilia of the various expeditions they've all been on, and we flipped through the Adrien's logbooks together, and it was like we were reading an adventure story. You know, he had never read them before, and the two of us were just reading this document, and it was like we were there in the cabin with him. They don't have any, they obviously don't have any reminiscences, though they have opinions about what may have gone through their ancestors' mind. But I think it was mostly in order to be able to have access to their archives. But they were nothing if not welcoming and kind and open-hearted. And then I met with the descendants of Lecointe, the man I read about in the excerpt that I read, and they were also quite helpful in helping me get access to archives. So again, it wasn't necessarily about interviewing them so much as convincing them that I was a worthy custodian of their stories.
What's next? What's next on the docket? Now that you've conquered Antarctica, where's next on your travels?
Well, the travels, next is Miami, for a story that I'm writing for Vanity Fair, but which may turn into a book. And I can't say more than that, except to say that I swore that I wasn't going to write about another story that gripped me was the story of another ship.
Well, thank you for taking the time for doing this tonight. I greatly appreciate this. This story is fascinating, and I'm glad that you were able to get this down, and your friend convinced you to write the book. So so continued success with this. Thank you for doing it, and good luck with Miami, and good luck with this book.
I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me, and I hope you enjoy the book.
Absolutely. All right. All right. Thanks for doing this. Congratulations, and thank you everyone for joining us. Good luck with this.
Bye-bye.